On Wednesday, June 5th, the Karen Reed murder trial continued with day 20 of testimony. And yes, we are still in the prosecution's case in chief. On day 20, we heard from 3 witnesses. First, we wrapped up the testimony of Ashley Vaillier, the forensic scientist from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. Then we heard from Christina Hanley, another forensic scientist from the same lab. And finally, we heard from Sergeant Yuriy Bukhenik of the Massachusetts State Police. Now, ADA Adam Lally did not finish the direct examination of Trooper Bukhenik, so that will need to pick up again on the morning of day 21. But there was some interesting information that came out, particularly on cross-examination of both the forensic scientists related to the apparent pieces of plastic and the apparent pieces of glass presented by the prosecution. But the prosecution was not without their wins in day 20 also. So, did the defense poke enough sizable holes in the prosecution's case in chief? And did the prosecution make enough headway in theirs? Watch until the end and let me know what you think. Let's get into it. So, let's dive right in. Okay, so like I said, first the prosecution wrapped up the testimony of Ashley Vaillier, a forensic scientist from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. It took forever, but we finally got to see where Lally was going with this particular testimony when we finally saw photos of these pieces taped together. In the process, Mix Vaillier testified about the process that they used to compare these pieces and ultimately fit them together. And so what we ended up with was an image of the taillight and the housing taped up together with most of the pieces of plastic reassembled. Now, I will say though, on cross-examination, David Yannetti quickly scored some points for the defense. He did this by pointing to testimony that Mix Vaillier had given at one point on direct examination that some of the pieces of taillight had come labeled as debris found with John O'Keefe's clothing. And so Yannetti pointed back to that labeling and elicited agreement from Mix Vaillier that there were different categories of things in the evidence package. This included dirt and debris, several apparent hairs, and several pieces of red apparent plastic and clear apparent plastic that were loose and not embedded in any other material. And Mix Vaillier agreed that they didn't test the dirt and debris, nor did they test any of the apparent hairs that were found on his clothes. Now, I'll note that in any kind of a case, there is bound to be something that the police opted not to test. And this is something that is often pointed out by the defense, regardless of how important that sort of argument is. Truthfully, the police can't possibly test absolutely everything that they come across, so they have to make decisions as to how far to go forensically speaking. But we do always want to know that the biggest questions have been answered after having been asked, and so we can confidently say that the investigation was thorough enough to make certain conclusions. And in a case where we are interested to find out if there is any canine DNA on the victim, it's particularly interesting that they found these apparent hairs and didn't test them for anything. Maybe they belonged to John or Karen, or literally anyone else that they came in contact with on the night of January 28th / morning of January 29th. Or maybe they belonged to someone else entirely. Maybe even a canine. The thing is, we can't really say one way or another because it was never tested. But another big thing that came out on cross-examination was the fact that although the incident occurred on January 29th, 2022, the evidence was all submitted together on March 14th, 2022. That's a full 6 weeks after the incident. And as Yannetti went over, a bunch of these evidence packages show varying evidence collection dates going back as far as February 3rd, 2022. But it seems that all of these were actually brought in on March 14th, which is very strange. And so this leads to the question, where were those taillight pieces between January 29th and March 14th? Or rather, where were those pieces between their date of collection and March 14th? Why weren't they brought in on, say, the same date that they were noted to have been collected? Now, maybe there's a reasonable explanation for this, but without any explanation by the prosecution, we just have a big question about that, which does cast a shadow of reasonable doubt. And this once again gets into the topic of whether or not Trooper Michael Proctor will be called to testify in this trial. Rumor has it the prosecution may actually decide not to call him after all. And it does at this point feel like the prosecution is trying to call as many witnesses as possible to testify as essentially piecemeal stand-ins for Trooper Proctor. But typically in a criminal case, the lead investigator is a material witness, a star witness. And if they're trying to avoid calling Trooper Proctor, there still are questions that need to be answered somehow. And the question of what happened to this evidence, which has his name on it, between January 29th and March 14th is a big question. And the best person to answer it, you would think, is the lead investigator who's in charge of overseeing this investigation to include the evidence gathering of this particular case. And not to mention the guy whose name is on the evidence bags. So if the prosecution doesn't call Trooper Proctor and they don't have someone else to provide that explanation, they may be up a certain creek without a paddle, so to speak. And on another note, Yannetti also pointed out, and Mix Vaillier agreed, that the taillight pieces that were gathered in early February were very small pieces. But all of the large pieces of the taillight that were eventually found came in like weeks later. And all of these later pieces appeared to be gathered by Trooper Proctor, while the smaller pieces were found by Trooper DeChico. And so this is yet another peculiarity about these taillight pieces. To reinforce this, when Trooper O'Hara testified about combing through the scene on January 29th, 2022 and finding 5 or 6 taillight pieces, those were all very small pieces. Now, granted, he did testify that they were only looking for like an hour or two. And he said that it was still actively snowing while they were looking. So it is reasonable to say that there could, at least theoretically, be more pieces out there when they wrapped up their search that day. However, why wouldn't they resume the search the next morning is another question. And beyond that, why would these pieces be showing up weeks later, presumably long after the snow has had time to melt? And if they were coming through this as methodically as Trooper O'Hara has said, it would make sense that they would find the bigger pieces first and the smaller pieces later. So for me, for some reason, this part of the prosecution's case in chief just doesn't seem to add up logically. But what do you think? Does it seem like that's all a big nothing burger to you, or does that sound suspicious? Let us know in the comments down below. Anyway, the prosecution's next witness, and their 54th witness overall, was Christina Hanley. She was another forensic scientist from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. And she actually testified pretty similarly to Mix Vaillier, except that Miss Hanley fit together the pieces of apparent glass that were brought in, presumably from the crime scene. But oddly enough, unlike in Mix Vaillier's testimony, during Miss Hanley's testimony, the jury wasn't shown any photos of the glass jigsaw pieces either separated out or put together with tape. Instead, Miss Hanley just testified about the process she took to fit these pieces together and basically how she went about it. Now, during direct, it wasn't exactly obvious that this was really telling of anything. But then on cross-examination, testimony came out that seems to hint at why the prosecution may not have wanted to show photos of these glass pieces taped together. To give you the bottom line up front on this part, Ms. Hanley agreed with defense attorney Alan Jackson that the pieces of apparent glass found on the bumper do not actually match up with any of the pieces of glass from, say, the cocktail glass. Now, to work towards this conclusion, Jackson pointed out basically that there appear to be a few groups of apparent glass pieces. One of these was 9 pieces of apparent glass marked as item 7-12. Then there were 6 pieces of apparent glass marked as item number 3-2. Now, those pieces in the second group apparently matched up to produce a cup. And then it sounds like there was a single piece of apparent glass marked as item 7-14. And item 7-14 was found on the bumper of Karen Reed's SUV. And basically all of this added up to the conclusion that the apparent glass found on the bumper did not match the glass that made up the cup.
My question is a relatively simple one. Is this and if you don't understand something on the document, just say so. Okay. Is this a visual representation, an accurate visual representation of what you just testified to in terms of what matched and what didn't match? Where the green matches, the circle with the red through it doesn't match?
I would need to go through my conclusion and compare to confirm.
Fair enough. It is accurate to say, we'll use a cheat sheet for a second. It is accurate to say that the cup was not found to match any items that were found on the bumper. That's correct, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Also, it's fair to say that the piece recovered under 714, the single piece of glass recovered under 714, does not match either the cup, nor does that piece match any of the 9 pieces in 712, correct?
And you can look at your notes if that's easier for you. We just want the right answer, Mr. Jackson, right?
Of course.
So
That's all I want.
take your time with your notes if that's easier for you.
So I'm sorry, can you just repeat the last question that you asked for?
The single piece of glass under 714 neither matches the cup, nor does it match any of the 9 pieces found in 712. In other words, it stands alone.
So that's correct. So
Okay.
714, there was no physical match between 714 and 3-2 or any of the pieces in 7-12.
Thank you for that. And then my final question is, the only piece of material, glass material, that was recovered from the bumper, item E, the only thing that any piece on that bumper matched was the single piece of glass found in 714. Correct?
So piece E from item 3-3 was the piece that I examined microscopically and instrumentally. It was found to be consistent in physical and instrumental properties with 7-14.
And that's the only piece of material on that bumper, in that section. In other words, in 3-3, that matched anything else in your analysis. The piece that was found singularly at, under 714, correct? The only match.
Yes, it was found to be consistent.
Thanks. That's all I have. Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay.
So this would seem to throw quite a bit of a wrench into the prosecution's case if the cocktail glass that was found on scene can't really be linked to Karen Reed's SUV. Without that link, how can the jury conclude, like the prosecution has been claiming this whole time, that Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe while he was holding the cocktail glass, smashing it on her car in the process? Now, of course, it does not mean necessarily that definitively she couldn't have hit him while he was holding it. But as we analyze this case with the necessary burden of proof in mind, as well as the promises that the prosecution made to the jury about the evidence that they would see at the beginning of this trial, we have to remember the prosecution has to prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. If the prosecution promised that they would be showing the jury forensic proof that links Karen's SUV to the point of impact with John O'Keefe's body, they have a few problems right now. First, there's no DNA match between John and anything that was found on the undercarriage of the SUV, as was confirmed on day 19 of this trial. Second, there's the questionable nature of John O'Keefe's hair actually being able to stick to the bumper of the SUV past wind, snow, and melting ice. And now it looks like the glass on the bumper is not actually a match to the cocktail glass the prosecution has made such a big deal about. Now, personally, I do think that these are all big problems for the prosecution's case, but hey, maybe you disagree. If so, let me know in the comments why you do. Anyway, the final witness of the day was the Commonwealth's 55th witness, Sergeant Yuriy Bukhenik. He is from the Massachusetts State Police, as we know, since we've heard so much about him before this point in the trial. Now, his direct examination took up the rest of the day and did not conclude at the end of the day. So we definitely have yet to see this testimony get tested on cross-examination, and there are a number of things that I'm curious to see if the defense will jump on. One of these is a bit of video surveillance that a lot of people have been talking about around social media. This was video from the Canton PD Sally Port when the SUV was brought in around 5:30 p.m. on January 29th, 2022. Now, the jury has no way of knowing this, nor will they likely find out at any point that apparently this footage was only very recently turned over by the prosecution to the defense. Now, I will say I haven't been following the pretrial litigation in nearly as much detail as others have, so I haven't been able to verify this myself. But apparently the prosecution may have previously said that this footage was missing, and Lally, I suppose, gave an explanation that the Sallyport footage cameras were motion activated or something. So there's been a problem with just getting this footage to begin with, apparently. But when it was ultimately introduced by the prosecution, it did show the arrival of the SUV, and it showed the police putting caution tape around it to keep others away from the vehicle. However, there was a lot of discussion in this channel's chat as well as elsewhere around social media about whether or not this footage was presented to the jury mirror imaged. I personally went back and forth on this during the stream, but looking back, it does appear to be mirror imaged. You can see this with the number 4 on the garage door, which appears backward. You can also see on the bottom of the video that the word police written on the old police cruiser is also backwards. Now, it was posited in my chat that maybe this was the front of the police cruiser, in which case it could have been written backwards so that it appears normal in the rear view mirror of someone getting pulled over. And this would be a reasonable explanation for why it would be written backwards and on the front of the car. But then I saw other images put up to Twitter by Brandy Churchwell of the 13th Juror podcast that show pretty definitively that this actually is the back of the cruiser, not the front. So the word police really shouldn't be written backwards on it. Now, aside from all of that, another thing to note is that the date and timestamps on the surveillance footage are not mirror imaged. And now this does introduce some questions like, why is it mirror imaged? How did that happen? How did the underlying footage get mirror imaged, but the timestamp didn't? Was the timestamp added later? What does that even mean for the reliability of this footage as a whole? And otherwise, what does it mean about the veracity of those timestamps? At the very least, it does show that from this angle, we can't actually see the right tail light at all. It's completely obfuscated by the SUV. And that's important because all of this footage is helping to piece together what that tail light looked like at various points during the day. But now, this particular bit of surveillance footage can't really tell us anything material about the condition of the tail light in that moment. Now, another thing that was pointed out by some people was also the fact that there is apparently a jump in the timestamps. Specifically, when it reaches 5:44:01 p.m., it then jumps to 5:46:48 p.m. Now, what this means to you might be different depending on your particular perspective. Maybe there was nothing to be seen in that particular footage, or maybe there was something that was actually very important that was cut out. Whether or not the jury noticed it at this point is entirely up in the air. So it'll be interesting to see if the defense chooses to cross-examine on this particular point, as well as the mirror image footage overall. Okay, anyway, let's talk a little bit more about what Trooper Bukhenik testified about on direct examination. In the beginning, he started off talking about the fact that on January 29th, 2022, he got a call around 6:44 a.m. about what had happened. He said that he drove to the scene and met up with Trooper Michael Proctor. And by that point, apparently both John and Karen had been taken to the hospital. He testified about eventually interviewing Jen McCabe, Matt McCabe, and Brian Albert at the McCabe house. Then he said that he went to the hospital where he viewed and identified John's body. He said that when he arrived, John's clothes were basically in a pile on the floor. And so he and Trooper Proctor gathered up the clothes and sealed them into evidence bags. Now, Trooper Bukhenik also said that it was apparent that there was vomit on the clothes, which was interesting because I hadn't actually remembered anyone else talking about vomit. However, it was pointed out in chat that Mr. Flamati, one of the paramedics, had testified about the presence of vomit on John's clothes earlier in the trial on, I think, day 5. Now, another thing that Trooper Bukhenik had noted was the fact that the clothes were also soaking wet. So later on, back at the station, he said that he had aired them out to dry them and then later placed them once again into an evidence bag. Anyway, he also described John's injuries, and the prosecution showed photos of John to the jury. The stream feed, however, did not get to see those images because the court has placed limitations on the media's distribution of the more sensitive images from this trial. Anyway, Trooper Bukhenik testified about John's eyes being swollen and black, that there was a small laceration above his right eye, and that he had what Trooper Bukhenik called abrasions on John's upper right arm. But one thing that was interesting was that Lally kept trying to get testimony from Trooper Bukhenik on the causation of these injuries. Now, this was entirely improper because even though Trooper Bukhenik apparently has investigated all kinds of deaths to include those resulting from head injuries, he still is not qualified to give that kind of testimony. That is opinion testimony that needs to be given proper foundation in that he's had the requisite education, training, and experience to be able to give that kind of an opinion. In other words, an expert opinion. So this was properly kept out of evidence. Anyway, next Trooper Bukhenik was asked to open up the evidence bags and show the clothes to the jury. So now the jury has actually seen these items in real life in 3D. After this, Trooper Bukhenik testified about going out to Dighton later that day to see Karen Read at her parents' house. He testified that he was allowed to enter the parents' home and he interviewed Karen while she was sitting on the couch. Here's what he said that she told him during this interview. Apparently, she said that they went out on the night of January 28th. She said that she drank vodka soda at the bar. When he asked her if she had left C.F. McCarthy's bar with a beverage, she said no. Obviously, this is inconsistent from testimony that we have heard from other witnesses so far, and this is also going to be an inconsistent point from what Trooper Bukhenik testifies later after reviewing surveillance footage. Anyway, next she told him that after McCarthy's, they went to the waterfall where they spent about an hour. After that, she drove to 34 Fairview Road and dropped off John because she said that she was having some sort of stomach issues. Then she apparently said that she made a 3-point turn and left. On this point, he said that he asked her for details on how she moved the car to make this 3-point turn. And when asked about the damage to her vehicle, she said, "I don't know. It happened last night." She also said that the next morning she began looking for him. And when she found him, she tried doing CPR. Anyway, after the interview was complete, a tow truck had apparently come and was basically ready to tow Karen's SUV back to Canton PD so that they could search the car. At this point, Lally introduced a number of ring videos showing the tow truck picking up the SUV. And now I was really hoping that we'd be able to get a good look at the right taillight to compare it to what the jury had just been shown from Ashley Vaillier's testimony about the taillight pieces. But none of this footage really provided a decent angle. One thing that did get introduced, however, was the ring footage from John O'Keefe's house showing a potential collision between Karen's and John's cars on the morning of January 29th around 5 a.m. To me personally, this does look like Karen's SUV made contact with John's, but I can also see people disagreeing with this. At the same time, when she turns to leave, the ring footage captures probably the best look yet at this taillight. And I will say, there is quite a bit of white light coming from it, indicating that it was in fact damaged. However, there is still quite a bit of red light there as well, so it'll be interesting to see this come up on cross-examination, especially in light of Ashley Vaillier's testimony. Now, the last part of this direct examination before the day ended was another series of videos and stills from C.F. McCarthy's and the waterfall. Initially, my reaction was, we've already seen this. What is Lally's point? But towards the end, it did become clear that the purposes of this was to basically count out how many times Karen got a new drink at the bar. At C.F. McCarthy's, they count out 7 drinks total. These were all tall glasses, and many of them included a shot for her to drop into her glass to mix in. The drinks with shot glasses mixed in definitely do suggest that these were in fact alcoholic drinks. And I will say, I didn't keep track of how many of these drinks included shots. There were at least 2, but maybe as many as 4 or more. I just wasn't really tracking it. However, either way, this is finally concrete testimony about Karen drinking alcohol on the night of January 28th. This is also reinforced by the fact that Trooper Bukhenik also testified about what he found in the bar tab receipts. According to the receipts, both John and Karen each paid $52.80 for drinks that night. And 2 of the drinks that Karen bought were $10 charges for Tito's vodka. I feel like I've been begging for testimony like this over the last 6 or 7 weeks, and finally the prosecution presents something that points towards Karen drinking enough that night to have driven while under the influence. This was something that I really would have loved to have seen at the beginning of this trial as opposed to much later like it did, but there it is. Now, of course, this is what this looks like before cross-examination, and it'll be interesting to see what the defense does with this testimony on cross. Now, Trooper Bukhenik also testified to seeing in the surveillance footage that Karen left McCarthy's with a drink in hand shortly after getting her 7th drink. And sure enough, the footage does seem to show it. However, then he also testified to seeing her at Waterfall picking up a drink from another table and sipping it. He said that this drink was shorter and fatter than the drink that she actually came in with. So this would suggest an 8th drink. However, I've watched this footage multiple times and I still have yet to pick out what he's talking about. Karen is supposed to be in the upper right-hand corner, and every time I've looked, I just see gray blobs moving around. Maybe it's just me, but I just can't seem to pick out anyone picking up a drink and sipping from it. So like I said, the prosecution is saying that this is her 8th drink, but personally, I can't see it. Maybe you can though, in which case let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, all in all, it seems like day 20 was a bit of a mixed bag for both the prosecution and the defense. The defense pulled a win with the testimony about the glass pieces not matching up between the bumper and the cup. But now the prosecution, in my opinion, also made some major headway, particularly with the evidence related to the DUI charge through Trooper Bukhenik. However, it will be interesting to see how this testimony holds up on day 21 when Trooper Bukhenik gets cross-examined. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Did the prosecution score some points here? What do you make of that Sally Port video footage and the mirror image presentation of it? How much weight do you think should be given to the testimony about the glass pieces not matching up? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more daily coverage of the Karen Read trial, both in daily recaps and in live gavel-to-gavel testimony, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next one is out. See you for day 21.